Record now.
Okay, great.
Great. All right, recording.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the, the third installment of the NASPA webinars, the on-demand webinars this year. We're excited to offer these to all of the faculty, whether you're able to be here present with us during the session, but also after the session. We're glad to have Dr. Tracy Tempaskia, as well as Dr. Dorian McCoy here with us today. They're going to be talking about balancing our faculty roles and responsibilities in today's tumultuous climate. And so this particular session stemmed from the National Conference Faculty Breakfast that we have annually at the conference. And so there were many conversations that kind of stemmed around concerns and challenges and new things that faculty are facing on their campuses. And so we thought it'd be a great idea to have Tracy and Dorian here with us to engage with us in the conversation. So I will turn it over to them to have a great conversation. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And we're going to start with quick introductions. So as Amy mentioned, my name is Tracy Poon-Tambassia. I'm a professor of clinical education at the University of Southern California in the Russier School of Education. And this year, I'm also chairing the faculty division at NASPA. So that means I get to work with really great faculty members that constitute the council, the faculty council. And this topic definitely resonates with conversations that we've been having. And I will come back to that in a minute, but I'm gonna let Dorian introduce himself.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm Dorian McCoy. I am an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I had the pleasure of serving as a Region 3 faculty representative to the Faculty Council the previous 2 years.
And we miss Dorian. Even though we love our Region 3 faculty rep, we miss Dorian. So
I miss y'all too.
Yeah, we want you back sometime. So let me just give a little bit of context and also give you a framework for what we're going to be talking about today. So Amy let us know that the theme of the online webinars this year is the civically engaged faculty. And that means a whole lot of different things. And I know that there have been great online conversations about that already. Today, Dorian and I are using this opportunity in context of this theme of civically engaged faculty to talk about how what happens in our world around us and on our campuses impacts faculty and how they teach and how they address issues in graduate preparation programs. Because we all know that what happens outside of the classroom comes into the classroom, and there are opportunities and challenges with that. This is something that we've talked about on the council. It's something we've talked about at conferences, at APLU, and also NASPA. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of that. So Dorian, in a few minutes, is going to share with you some of the discussion we had at the Faculty Assembly Breakfast at the 2018 NASPA Annual Conference. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how that has sort of fed into conversations in this past 6 or 8 months about how faculty are doing their work around these civic and national issues. And then Dorian and I have some questions for you if there's an opportunity for discussion around this topic. So I'm going to hand it over to Dorian at this point and let him share with you conversations at the Faculty Assembly Breakfast.
Thank you. So really, again, what prompted this is just what is our role given the current climate. And we started off with a prompt. And so that prompt was, what are prevailing or pressing social issues? What prevailing or pressing social issues are of such significance to our campuses that we, as preparation program faculty, should express our shared voice within NASPA? So having that prompt, we divided into maybe 9 groups. We brainstormed, we discussed, and I have a list of those quote unquote issues. I'm not going to read all 9 of those, but there's a brief summary that I will read. Many participants described issues of hate, free speech, and safety being prevalent. Ideas of collaboration across associations and departments, and furthering educating at various levels to promote student success are mentioned multiple times. Additionally, concerns regarding gun safety control, Title IX, mental health, and how to best address social justice issues emerge. So that's a brief summary of what came out of those 9 groups. I was just to go through and highlight several from each group. This student protest, school violence, pluralism, immigration, supporting DACA, the integrity of Title IX, Title IX rollbacks. There's a lot of similarity between many of the groups. Let's see what's not. Again, gun safety, student affairs and citizenship, hate speech, sexual violence. So there seem to be some fairly consistent themes that emerge from each of the groups. And so what we did, we took this information, compiled it into not really a brief report or a report of the responses that's been shared with the faculty council. We've discussed this, what was it, May, Tracy, that we got together and discussed, and now we're bringing it back around to this particular webinar.
Thank you, Dorian. And so what emerged out of that conversation at the annual conference was, a little deeper conversation within the council about those findings, which were both surprising and not surprising. I think that what emerged from the faculty assembly, the larger conversation, is that there are a range of very serious and very deep challenges that our grad prep faculty are seeing related to issues on a campus. Not just related about civic engagement, but around safety and wellness. And that while there are curricular ways in which this can be addressed, basically to say, there are ways in which we can work with graduate students to talk about the theory and the research around these issues. What's more challenging is preparing them to face these as new professionals and preparing them to face these in their assistantships, right, in their internships, because they're working as paraprofessionals already. They are encountering students who also question safety. They're encountering students who are feeling challenged around really major issues around our country, around racial identity, safety, around issues of race and identity, and also in gender, and also issues related to mental health and wellness as well. So not only among our graduate students, but the students with whom they are working. This has led to further conversation within NASPA. There's a lot of interest in bringing together practitioners and faculty, grad prep faculty, to talk about ways in which there could be greater collaboration and communication about what's happening in classrooms and what's happening on campuses to better prepare new professionals, not only for the actual work, but also for the longevity and sustainability of their careers. We're seeing young people, young professionals burning out. We're seeing young professionals question their purpose in our field and our work, and as a result, sometimes leaving the profession. And so some of the conversations have been around meaningful application of theory to practice, right? Which is something we've always experienced in grad prep programs, but it seems almost like the ramifications of that are even greater when we're talking about immediate pressing issues of safety and wellness. There's been discussions also about what student affairs supervisors are seeing and what they're expecting from new professionals. And not only the question of whether grad prep faculty are aware of those expectations, but also the question whether those are realistic, considering the developmental process. And are supervisors expecting, I mean, I don't want to say too much, but expecting a skill set that some of our graduates may not be prepared to provide. Maybe it means maybe more emphasis on practicum or more emphasis on internships are needed. I don't have the answer to that, but those are certainly questions that have been raised. And what is our current role collectively in educating students about current issues nationally, in higher education broadly, and locally? There's quite a bit of discussion at this about this very topic at APLU recently. I was invited to join a panel of faculty and practitioners to talk about ways in which leaders, faculty and practitioner leaders in the field can strategize about better preparing new professionals for not only resilience, but also effectiveness to address these really difficult challenges. And two of the conversations around that session was about the question of whether students are arriving as activists and whether they're carrying that level of activism to their jobs. Now that there's no value or negative value attached to that statement, although there has been questioning about whether graduate prep programs are preparing advocates or activists. And, some of us would argue that perhaps, those are identities along a spectrum, not to be viewed as, diametrically opposed. But there's also the question of who we're attracting to the field. There was some discussion about the fact that students who want to see change and to create change are also attracted to the field of student affairs because they see this as a place where they can are welcomed, accepted, but also a place where they can be impactful and that they believe that they can create change. So again, this is not a judgment about whether advocates or activists are better or worse. It's really the question of what kind of messaging are we sending to prospective students about agency and about leadership, and whether the field is prepared to follow through on really reflecting upon those change, and whether we believe that agency is important, not just among our new professionals, but among all of us as leaders, as higher education leaders. So those are some really big perspectives and questions that I'm not really posing right now, but I think those are philosophical questions about our position as grad prep faculty, as higher ed leaders, as student affairs leaders, about who's enrolling in our programs, how are we preparing them, and how are we prepared to manage those expectations, and also the desire for change once professionals come into the field.
So, Tracy, having said that, we have 2 to 3 questions we'd like to pose to maybe prompt some dialogue. Is that okay?
Sounds great.
So, question number 1, and I'll go ahead and read all 3 of them, but and then we'll come back to the first one. First question: a number of issues were noted by faculty at the annual conference breakfast. Do any of these issues resonate with your experience on your campus? Are there other salient issues that have arisen in recent years that you believe are important to the association or for faculty to discuss and address? Second, what are some of the ways in which faculty on your campus, particularly graduation or graduate prep faculty, have addressed some of these challenging discussions? Any effective practices that you might be willing to share? Third, what are some of your thoughts related to the emerging challenges faced by grad prep faculty in preparing new professionals for work in student affairs departments? In what ways do you feel they are prepared? What are issues, experiences you feel may need additional reinforcement learning while on the job, i.e. on the job training? So those are the 3 questions we came up with. We can start with the first one. So are there a number of issues were noted? Are there other salient issues that have arisen on your campus or even nationally that we should be addressing?
And I just posted the question in the chat box as well.
Okay.
Hey, this is Susan. Hi, folks.
Hi, Susan.
Hi. The list that you read through resonates with things we're talking about. For the most part, it is, they are perennial. Some of them maybe come more to the foreground than others. I think in 2016-17, we were talking a whole lot more about immigration and DACA. It hasn't gone away, and some hate speech issues hasn't gone away, but it was more to the fore. Last year, I think some free speech stuff and safety. This year, Title IX has just come up, where only a year ago it was like, we've talked enough about Title IX. So while the things that you raised are always there, guns is another one that, might move in or out depending on incidents or policies or sort of political stuff, which I think speaks to the point raised about advocates versus activists, and what does that look like, not just for how we prepare our students to go into the profession, but the ways we think about that even as faculty, or even just as a overall organization, NASPA or others, that what is our organizational stance as lobbyists, which I don't think we really see ourselves at, and are we even modeling some of the behaviors that we want others to then practice as they're in there as professionals. So
Susan, your comments really resonate. In some of our preparation for this, we were talking about what does advocacy look like, and then when does that cross over into activism, particularly for those of us that may be at public or state universities, and what are the expectations around that? We talk about our new professionals, our practitioner educators being advocates for their students, but to what degree? Up to what line do we go, and then we have to stop because we've crossed some, should I say, political line that shouldn't be crossed, or we're stepping outside the scopes of our jobs or whatever that may be. So what exactly, when we talk about advocating for our students, my question always is, within what limits? Where do we stop? And I think that's something that many of our entering students are struggling with, those that are entering preparation programs, grad prep programs, because I think those students are attracted to some of the work that we do because they have been student leaders, they are student change agents on their respective campuses, and they want to continue to do that work. How many of us are reading admissions applications or a professional philosophy that's an assignment, and a new student, a new grad student talks about this one practitioner or faculty member who advocated for them, who helped them make meaning, who made them feel like they mattered on their respective campuses. And then we say, we want you to do the same thing for your students when you get here, but only to a certain degree. So I don't really know how we balance that. And I think that's something we're grappling with as a profession, but it can't just be a discussion that the faculty has. It has to be a discussion that we're having with senior student affairs officers, dean of students, AVCs, and on up the ladder.
Dorian, you raised such a good point because, we often talk about our work in student affairs and how it's a calling. And we tell students, I tell my master's students, you got to be all in. You got to be all in. But yet we say that, but we also say, well, no, not really, because you got to take care of yourself. And then there are also rules. and you also have to, you have to watch these boundaries. And I think that can be confusing. When we talk about the passion that drives our work and our commitment, but for new professionals, sort of discerning where that line is, where is the line is when I need to pull back, when I need to rethink this, when I need to care for myself, when I need to think about my relationship to the university as an employee. What does that mean? What are my obligations and responsibilities in that regard as well?
Point well made.
Yeah, this is Sherry. This resonates with me, right? Because I straddle both lines. I'm a dean of students. I'm also a professor teaching the capstone at San Diego State University, which is Current Critical Issues, which is trying to help new graduate students make that transition to be successful in their role as new professionals. What has been a challenge, and I haven't quite figured out if this is unique to our program, have tried to talk to as many faculty as I can, but we're starting to see with our students more of that call out rather than call in culture. They have a lot of frustration that our system is broken and they want it fixed. And so, it's an issue that I wrestle with a lot and am trying to figure out, how do I balance that? I mean, we have students who still as second years put their activism before the needs of the offices that they have assistantships in. And so, trying to walk that fine line of how do you support students in that, but at the same time, how do you prepare them for then being new professionals where they may not have that same sort of leeway? And, how do you answer the questions about selling out? Because I get that quite a bit, right? Is I talk about how to walk that line of being an administrator and being an advocate for students, but at the same time trying to change the system from within in the ways that I can. So, I would love to see a summit, right, focusing on some of the things that you've talked about of how do we balance all of this? How do you have practitioners, some of whom may also be faculty, and faculty coming together to wrestle with this?
Sherry, that was such a powerful case example that you offered. And, it's a field-based issue, it's a curricular issue, but it is also a developmental issue. And I don't mean that the last point as in a condescending way. I mean to say that understand the complexity of our work, and the fact that, you use the phrase walking the line, and I even use the term drawing the line, but the fact is that there is no line. Like, we move back and forth. It is not so clear or easy to instruct or to teach an individual that there are times when you have to give, and there are other times where you have to stand for something, but you have to understand the complexity and the context to decide when you can be most effective and when it's going to be a futile action. And I wouldn't know. I don't know how I would effectively teach that, other than to encourage students to think deeply about the complexity of context, and also knowing that about choosing your battles as opposed to trying to fight every battle.
Yeah, and I think these are all great points, and I'm really resonating with this conversation because I just so this is the last week before finals, so this is when all the projects are due, and the grads are a little bit more stressed than normal,
Mm-hmm.
and the first year students who are finishing their first semester, I'm finding a lot of conversations surrounding that balance, and then you mix in mental health issues, both with the students that they're serving and supporting, but also their own mental health. That adds another layer to this nuanced line, right? And being able to determine when to walk the line, when to draw the line, when to navigate between the lines. But I've also had some conversations about identity. And so we're talking, with students about knowing who you are as a professional and the various identities in which you hold most salient. And then also, they're getting mixed messages in how much of themselves they can bring to the table, or
Mm-hmm.
how far they can push certain policies or rules. And so I think they're finding themselves in that kind of quagmire moment of, well, but I want to be all in because that's my passion, but I have to figure out how to, for lack of better words, kind of play the game and navigate and build that political capital to maybe win most effectively long term, right? So the short term versus long term gains, I think, is something that the grads are finding themselves they're just wrestling with that. So I don't know. Those are some things that I'm seeing just here with my students. But I think that mental health piece, as a field, we're going to have to really take on.
Amy, I think you hit a really good point about choosing your battles. I talked to the first years in introduction and intro to student affairs. Everybody has that course. You have to develop or acquire capital. And I always ask, whose responsibility is that, and how do you go about it? I like to think it's a little bit of everybody's responsibility happening in the classroom, maybe navigating, maybe your supervisors are helping you, but I also wonder some supervisors aren't really they're not mentors, they're supervisors. And those are two different things, okay? So, and I've had to explain to students, You may expect your supervisor to be a mentor, and that may not be what they're there to do. Not every supervisor is a mentor. And so I'm not sure if they're learning that on the job, so to speak. Maybe they're learning it from faculty. Maybe they're learning it from mentors outside the classroom. I told someone last week, one of the best ways for you to get capital is to let your work speak volumes about you. Because if you are a good team player and you do good things, people are more apt to listen to you because they know your work is quality. Okay, so I hear what you're saying. I agree with you. I think we've got to educate them. Every generation, and every generation has millennials, type, Gen X, Gen Y, whatever. We stereotype them, right? And the previous generation goes, oh, what are we going to do now? Because this generation is much worse than we are. Okay, we're just throwing shade at them, right? Because somebody threw shade at us. But some of us, every generation, we're aspirational. We want to move quickly. And so I've had to tell some people in private conversations, I can walk in and say something to the vice chancellor that you can't say to the vice chancellor because you don't have that capital. And I get this look as, well, why? And I'm like, I don't even really know how to explain that to them, because they want to be able to go tell the president of the university, if you do it this way, it'll be better. And so it's a complex issue. It's complicated, and there's a lot of educating that needs to happen, and there needs to be a lot of patience. And I think that many of our practitioner educators, they forget that they were once new professionals and they don't have that patience anymore.
Shall we move on to the next question, which actually was related? I think we've actually touched upon. So what are some of the ways in which faculty in your campus, grad prep faculty and others, have addressed some of these challenging discussions? Any effective practices to share?
Well, I think there's a few different things. There's sort of being responsive to just current events. So I often do a check-in. Most of the time, check-ins are just, whatever kind of more operational things are on their minds. But then there's times that there are major events either that I bring to the conversation, or sometimes assignments are used that they have to kind of mine the Chronicle or higher ed. At its most elaborate, when I was at Kent State, we'd have these group tabletop assignments where they'd have to pull from either their campus or the headlines an event that then we had to, if you're familiar with the use of tabletops in like emergency management response. So again, from the very informal of just what's something that's happening that you want to talk about, all the way up to formally doing that, is a way for them to, one, start thinking and articulating what it is that they're seeing and what it means for their practice, to then formally strategizing. I think the piece over the years that's come to light is when I get students sort of mobilized in their thinking about what they might do, and then they go to their work sites, whether that's internships where they work full-time or an assistantship, and they start to feel a little more equipped to have I've had some students over the years say the only place that I can have this conversation is in the classroom because my workplace just doesn't want to deal with it at all. And so that's led me to ponder, like, what could we be doing more to professionally develop internship sites? Not that we have the time to do that, but it almost feels like there has to be some parallel work done, that while I'm trying to develop a capacity for new professionals, if they're bumping into continuing professionals that for a variety of political reasons, and then also how do I get my students to have some of the more I heard a colleague yesterday refer to the way that experiential learning is not just about serving, but it is about learning how to speak to power. And so I think I have to have parallel capacity building for my new professionals to be able to speak truth to power. But anyway, that's a lot.
Susan, what was interesting in so many conversations I've had with faculty and practitioners and through NASPA Faculty Council, but also at APLU around this issue was what was most surprising to me is related to what you're talking about, how grad prep faculty need support from leadership and practitioners, student affairs professionals. There needs to be a collaboration around this and a conversation. And what was surprising to me, and I mentioned this to Dorian the other day, that there seems to be a whole range of relationships between graduate prep faculty and student affairs practitioners on campuses. And you've got the whole range. Sherry was mentioning on this call that, you know, she has a leadership role in the division and she teaches. And that's a very common model. And then you have at the other extreme, individuals that say there's never a conversation. Like they literally know each other, but they never meet, they never talk, and there's tension. Mm-hmm. And it seems like most campuses are in the middle, where there is some conversation, there are relationships, but sometimes they're not substantive. Sometimes they're not around the curriculum. Sometimes there are relationships between grad prep faculty and the professionals in student affairs, but not necessarily around hiring, for instance. So what I was also hearing from student affairs practitioners is that their hiring has changed. The kinds of competencies they're looking for in terms of their needs are now often around case management. They're around data analytics. Mm-hmm. And most, I believe, grad prep programs around student affairs or HESA they may touch upon these things, but they're not really delving deeply. And so social workers and data analysts are being hired, which is not also a bad thing. It just is knowledge that I think grad prep faculty need to have, because it could influence decisions about curriculum in the future. Mm-hmm.
So this is my second year as the program coordinator, and I'm an assistant professor. And so the first year I spent really just kind of taking notes, right, and listening and building relationships. And this year, about a month ago, I held a meeting with the division as well as our faculty. And typically that meeting has been primarily focused on recruitment and, you know, our interview day and things of that nature. But this year I took a little different approach and talked about practicums and the experiences and the various ways that we really cross-pollinate and support one another in the work with our students, but also all the students on campus, and the ways that the graduate students are interacting and engaging with undergraduate students. And we actually I expected the conversation to last about 45 minutes, and we actually went almost an hour and a half. It seemed like they were really ready to engage in that discussion, which was really exciting. And so from that, I'm looking forward to maybe finding some nuanced ways to engage them in some discussions as we move forward. Still trying to identify kind of what that looks like. But for me, that was a really good indication that there was interest, and, you know, I think they felt valued by being involved in that type of conversation. You know, that it wasn't just, I need your support for this specific event, but it was really more focused on, from a curriculum standpoint, we've got these 3 practicums, and you all are helping to shape our students and their experience. And here's ways that I'm working on that, and here are ways that you are working on that. And so let's build together. So that was a really, I think, aspirational conversation and a good discussion that I hope can happen on other campuses as well. So that's just what comes to my mind in regards to how do we start to build those discussions and those conversations, and so that worked this time for me.
Yeah, Amy, I totally agree with you. We do that at the University of Tennessee. Admittedly, I haven't done it in the last 2 semesters because of timing, but in addition to meeting with the site supervisors, I think it's critical to have that relationship with the senior leadership team and the senior student affairs officer. I think we're really fortunate at UT that we have a phenomenal relationship between the Division of Student Life and the CSP, or the grad prep program. I just met with the Dean of Students literally before I came to the webinar. As I was walking into one building, the Vice Chancellor for Student Life was walking in. He's like, lunch next week, we got a lot to talk about. And I said, I don't know what that means. I don't know if I should be worried or not. And he just laughed. And so, but we have that relationship where we know this is a partnership. And we're actually having a faculty meeting Monday to talk about the type of students that we're recruiting. And I'm sure this is going to come up because something similar comes up every year. And I totally agree with you. We have to work as faculty to foster those relationships.
I think we also, in sort of high density areas, need to work across campuses. So I actually teach on a different campus than I work at. I work at UC San Diego. I teach at San Diego State. And we have students placed in graduate assistantships from SDSU on both campuses, as well as in other locations. So it takes a little bit more work, but I think, in the places where you have lots of institutions in one location, it's quite frequent in Southern California, but I know in other places in the country as well, we have to work a little harder to have those sorts of conversations, but they're critical. And I think all of the partners need to be at the table on the same page.
Should we move on to the third question, which again, I think we've touched on a little bit. What are some of your thoughts related to the emerging challenges faced by grad prep faculty in preparing new professionals? In what ways do you feel that new professionals are prepared, or what issues and experience do you feel may need additional reinforcement or learning while on the job? Any thoughts on that?
I'll venture to begin here. I agree that some of this we may have talked about. So at the risk of sounding redundant, and I've explored this a tiny bit in writing about the development of multicultural competence, and brought some critiques to how we do that, because we can risk having multiculturally competent practitioners who maintain the status quo. And that's very different from bringing a critical consciousness, almost activist perspective to what I think is the work we need to do. And I think that's generally a distinction. If you look at competencies broadly, there are those that sustain the organization as is, versus those that are going to be, because even concepts like, organizationally agile and adaptive leadership can still serve the marketplace or those in power. And so I think when I look at in what ways do grad prep programs, what are the skills that are being developed, there's, I think we have to kind of sort of critique and complicate some of that, because there's, how do I manage a budget? But then there's asking critical questions of sort of where do resources go and whose voices are being heard or represented in the allocation of funds. And so that's and we could say, well, those are more intermediate or advanced skills and it's not going to happen. But I think if we don't even engage in our curriculum students to think critically about sort of power, then they aren't ever gonna even wonder about how to develop more advanced skills. So,
Susan, I love that that framing, because it seems to me that a lot of the complexity when we talk about equity, when we talk about resource allocation, when we talk about values and ethics, that one of the threads that goes through is this issue about power. Who gets to set the tone? Who gets to make decisions about funding? How are policies framed? And again, power is sort of this elusive yet very, clear. Everybody understands what power is. So when we talk about who gets to write policies and procedures that benefit some or disadvantage others, that these are ways in which we can frame, but also create some basic understanding that these are issues around who has access to decision making and power and resources. So that was just such a nice way of encapsulating it.
I can quickly add, I used to, with a former colleague, he taught a course on power and politics in the organization, and we would have some fun debates around if we're only teaching one way of thinking about power in organizations, which is more hierarchical and power over. And he would say, but that's the way higher ed works. I have to teach students to know how to work within the system that is. And I said, well, then that's reproductive, because you're only always going to have the system that is. And if we don't at least introduce students to other ways of conceptualizing power and therefore how we lead, then you're never going to see anything different. So it's not that I expect everyone to be a critical theorist or a critical pedagogue, but if we don't offer sort of a broader way of thinking about how organizations have come to be structured the way they are and alternatives that are available, then students don't ever have the opportunity as new or continuing professionals to act in different ways within the organization. So.
Thank you. Any other responses or thoughts related to this?
So maybe a couple final comments for me. I'm also cognizant of the time. We've talked about a lot of issues. I don't know how much all of this can be political, but I don't know how much we've brought in the national political climate. And there's some that will tell you that has no influence, which I will argue against that. But I'm just wondering how that's affecting the work that we're doing and in preparing our students, and whether or not they feel prepared, particularly for those that might be at a state university that is, let's make this political, that's in a red state, or they're in a smaller private institution that may have more conservative values. And granted, all of our students are not liberal, even though that's not what some people believe all our students are just far left wing. We have a mix of students. But what I am saying, our students sometimes end up at a college that might not be a good match for them, and they don't know that until they get there. And I just wonder, how does the political climate play into that? And how do we help them navigate that, if that's even our responsibility, because we're on the front end of that process. And I had this conversation with a student yesterday who's getting ready to enter the job market. And they're like, well, how do I know it's the perfect job? I'm like, there's no such thing. And they said, well, it could be my dream job. And I'm like, I doubt you get your dream job as your first job. So.
Oh, Dorian, you're such a downer.
No, I'm more of a realist, but they know I've got their back.
Right. I'm teasing. No, you're.
I know it. I took it the way you intended it to be taken. So it's just something I thought about. And then in what ways do you feel they are prepared? This is just me personally. I always wonder how prepared they are. How good of a job did I do? Okay. But I tell them, I think we've given you a good foundation, but you're a lifelong learner. So this is only a foundation.
Mhm.
And then usually I'll get that validation at a conference, or they'll come back and it's something like this. It's not really a compliment, but it is. You know, I didn't realize how prepared I was until after my first semester. And I'm sitting there going, so what you're telling me is you had a good experience and you learned a lot. And I'm like, yeah, maybe. I say, you know what? It's all good. I'll take that.
Yeah, that's excellent closing thoughts. Anything else that others wish to contribute before we conclude? If there are none, Amy, I think we're all set.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for leading such a rich discussion on topics so closely connected to what we all do every day. And I think this discussion is going to continue on, particularly at the next faculty breakfast, I think, as well as the Faculty Institute at the National Conference. So I look forward to continuing our discussion, because I think, as lifelong learners, we're always continuing to learn from each other as well. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your semester.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thanks, Dorian, Amy, Sherry, and Susan. I'm going to stop recording. Okay, thanks. Bye.